When I travel any great distance, I travel by air. And there are a lot of things to consider when choosing which airline to travel to a destination. Of course, cost is a big issue. And we also consider how many layovers are involved and what time of day the flight is, because I'm not a big fan of taking the red-eye flights. But one consideration that really can't be overlooked is safety. When I get on an airplane, I want to have the confidence that the crew is capable and the aircraft is sound. If I found a dirt cheap trip to South Carolina, but then discovered that the aircraft had a long list of safety violations, I'd find another flight. It doesn't matter how cheap the flight is if it's not safe. Well, back in Paul's day, air travel wasn't a thing. So the way people got to long distances was by ship. And I suppose that some of the considerations of choosing a ship back then might be similar to some of the ways I choose a flight today. Cost might be a consideration. And how many times a ship had to port in other cities before it reached your final destination. And I would also think that safety would be a consideration as well. Of course, they wouldn't have the same level of safety precautions that we do today with modern travel. But one of the big safety considerations for sea travel back then was the time of year. There were simply certain times of the year, particularly during the autumn months, that travel was risky due to poor weather and strong winds. But when Paul sails to Rome to face trial, he doesn't have a choice as to what time of year he's going to travel. He travels as a prisoner. And as it happens, Paul is traveling in the fall season just as sea travel gets a little dicey. And as it turns out, Paul finds himself heading right into danger. And we see the story in Acts 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So Paul began his journey to Rome. He was on a ship from Adramyttium, and the ship embarked from the port in Caesarea. Caesarea had a wonderful man-made harbor that had been constructed by Herod the Great. Adramyttium was southeast of Troas in Asia Minor. And since this journey was being taken in the fall, this was probably going to be the final voyage that this particular ship planned to take before the stormy winter season kicked in. The ship was probably a small coasting vessel, not one that would venture out into the open sea for a major voyage. So somewhere along the way, Paul and the others would be transferred to a larger ship that is headed out to sea in the direction of Rome. Besides Paul, other prisoners are being transported. The Greek word means others of a different kind. So these other prisoners probably were not traveling to Rome to stand trial as Paul was. It was common to transport convicted criminals to Rome to be killed in the games for public entertainment. Well, a centurion named Julius is in charge. The centurion is a soldier in charge of 100 other soldiers. And Julius was probably a Roman citizen, as his name would suggest. He seems to be a reasonable man, and on the journey showed special consideration to Paul. Paul was a Roman citizen as well, and we will see appears to be traveling under minimum security. Besides his citizenship, the special treatment toward Paul is probably because he's traveling to Rome at his request, and neither Festus nor Agrippa could find fault with him. Along with Paul were Luke and Aristarchus. We know that Luke was along for the ride because as Luke writes the story, he uses the word we. We would sail for Italy. We boarded a ship and we put out to sea. Also on the trip was Aristarchus. He was from Thessalonica, probably receiving Christ as his Savior under Paul's ministry there. And we see him joining Paul in Ephesus to support his ministry in that city, and then accompanying Paul as he left Ephesus and traveled through Macedonia and Greece. He was one of the men who traveled with Paul to Rome to deliver the love offering for the church there. We have no record of either Aristarchus or Luke being arrested, so perhaps Aristarchus was allowed to go with Paul on the trip as Paul's personal attendant, and Luke as Paul's personal physician. And if so, we can see the special treatment that Paul was allowed. We pick it up in verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. So next day the ship ported in Sidon. And Sidon was 80 miles north of Caesarea. The fact that they made it to Sidon the next day suggests that they had smooth sailing at this point. And this being a cargo ship, they would need to take a few days to unload the cargo. And during that time, passengers often went ashore. These weren't giant cruise ships that provided lavish meals and nightly entertainment. Passengers were responsible to bring their own food and supplies. And at night, they would sleep on deck, either in the open or in tents that they brought and set up. As for prisoners, their food and supply was normally requisitioned by soldiers from locals. But for Paul, it was different. Paul was permitted to get off the ship and visit his friends in Sidon. His friends would put together the things needed for the long trip. So this is a prime example of Paul's special treatment. Certainly would not be normal practice for prisoners on the ship to leave for a few days to visit with friends. We have no details about the meeting of Paul and his friends in Sidon, but the people there no doubt helped supply his needs, encouraged him, and prayed for his journey and trial. Following Sidon, the ship sailed to Myra. The most direct route from Sidon to Myra would have been to travel to the south of Cyprus and then turn northwest toward Myra. But the autumn winds blew from the west and northwest, so the ship needed to stay close to the coast to shelter it from strong winds. So they traveled on the lee of Cyprus, and that would be the east of Cyprus, in between the island and the mainland. And once the ship passed the northeast peninsula of Cyprus, it would hug the coastline of Syria and then probably took advantage of the gentler breezes at night. The voyage from Sidon to Myra was about 450 to 500 miles and probably took about 15 days. At Myra, the prisoners were transferred to a larger seagoing ship. Myra was a prominent city in Lycia, which is modern-day Turkey. And in Myra, Julius found an Alexandrian grain ship headed for Italy. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket, so the grain ships would often sail from Egypt north to Asia Minor and then make their way west across the Mediterranean, using the islands as much as possible for protection. Then they set out for Rome on the larger ship, but it didn't go well. First, they met strong headwinds. So for several days, travel was slow going and quite difficult. The ship ended up near Cnidus, and they were way off course at this point. This is not the direction they wanted to go, but it was what the winds allowed. Cnidus had 2 harbors and nice accommodations, and would have been a pretty good place to wait it out for more favorable winds. But the winds would not cooperate, and they were unable to hold their course, so they never made it to Cnidus. Now, Paul didn't actually say they made it to Cnidus, but that they arrived off Cnidus, so near and yet so far. So the ship's captain decided to try heading south toward the island of Crete, which is the largest island in the Aegean Sea. When the weather's good, ships would sail to the north of Crete, but the weather now is far from good. When I think of this journey, I think of the theme song for Gilligan's Island. The weather started getting rough, the tiny ship was tossed. If not for the courage of the fearless crew, the minnow would be lost. Gilligan and his friends were stranded on a remote tropical island for years because of bad weather they encountered on a 3-hour tour. And of course, that's all fiction, and it's all silly too. But what Paul encountered on sea was not fiction. This was real life. And it wasn't silly. This was life and death stuff. The northern coast of Crete didn't have many good harbors and left ships unprotected against dangerous winds. So they decided to travel to the eastern tip of Crete, where Salmone is located, and then they hugged the southern coast of Crete where they could find more harbors. There was nothing about this part of the trip that was enjoyable. Paul said, "We moved along the coast with difficulty." And Paul was no wimp. He was a seasoned traveler and knew what to expect from sea travel. So Paul, he wasn't a guy like me. I got seasick on a cruise with the San Francisco Harbor. I got seasick on a deep sea fishing trip with my father-in-law, Joe. I got seasick on a snorkeling expedition off the coast of Maui. I got seasick on taco night during a cruise to Ensenada. And all my seasickness occurred during favorable weather and calm seas. I can't imagine being on this trip with Paul. If he said it's difficult, it's really difficult. This kind of sailing suggests strong opposing winds, high waves, drenching rain, endless heaving of the ship from side to side, sleepless nights, and endless retching. Finally, the ship made it to Fair Havens. But the name Fair Havens is misleading. By the name, you think it'd be a great place of safety and security, a place to find refuge from the storm. But in reality, the place didn't offer much protection. But beyond Fair Havens, the coastline veered sharply northward, exposing ships to the full force of northwesterly winds. So Fair Havens wasn't great, but beyond Fair Havens was worse. We pick it up in verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So sailing was getting more dangerous every day that passed. Paul mentions that the Day of Atonement was passed, and the Day of Atonement occurred on October 5 in AD 59. After that date, the unsettled weather patterns over the Mediterranean Sea made sailing hazardous. In those days, sea traffic completely ceased by early November. Much time had been lost due to weather and poor sailing conditions. It was frustrating for the ship's captain and the ship's owner, who wanted to get their grain to Italy. It was frustrating for Julius, who needed to get his prisoners to Rome. The centurion now had to decide whether to winter at Fair Havens or set sail and try to reach the port of Phoenix on the southern coast of Crete, about 40 miles away. Progress had been slow and sailing had been rough. Now, Paul saw nothing good from forging ahead. He knew it would be disastrous to the ship and cargo and people on board. So he lobbied for them to stay in Fair Havens. Better safe than sorry. It's kind of interesting when you think about it, that Paul even has a say in the matter. He's a prisoner. Can you imagine the scene? Huddled together are the ship's captain, the ship's owner, the centurion, and Paul, a prisoner. What's wrong with this picture? But prior to this voyage, Paul had written in 2 Corinthians 11:25 that he had already survived 3 shipwrecks. So he certainly knew what he was talking about. And maybe the others let him have a voice in the discussion because of his vast experience in sea travel as well as the shipwrecks he'd been in. In ancient times, ships had no compasses and they navigated by the stars. So Paul understood that with the skies overcast and strong winds buffeting the ship from the northwest, sailing west was all but impossible and very dangerous. But the final decision was made to sail on to Phoenix. They decided to sail on because Fair Havens was not a comfortable place to settle down. It was way too open to the winter storms. Phoenix had a more sheltered harbor. Obviously, the captain and the owner of the ship felt that since Phoenix was only 40 miles away, they could make it if they didn't waste any time. And in their minds, it was worth the risk. So Paul was outvoted, and on to Phoenix they went. However, they never made it to Phoenix. What's the takeaway in this story? It is that sometimes life is out of control. If Paul had his way, the ship would have stayed in Fair Havens. It would not have been comfortable or ideal, but they would have survived and eventually been able to complete their journey after winter passed. But Paul didn't have his way. He got to have his say, but he was outvoted. And so Paul, firmly believing that heading out to sea would prove disastrous, found himself heading out to sea anyway. It was out of his control. And that reminds me of how life is so often. It's out of our control. Sometimes we see things going from bad to worse and we're powerless to stop it. But really, when it comes down to it, we can't worry about what we can't control. When life takes a turn that appears to be heading to a crash, it's time to let Jesus take the wheel. 1 Peter 5:7 says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." As Paul considered what lay ahead, I'm sure he experienced some anxiety. He described the plan to go to Phoenix as disastrous. But knowing Paul, he trusted in the Lord and turned his anxious feelings over to him. It worked for Paul, and it can work for us as well. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you.